Well, hello. I think I've already been introduced. I'm not sure, are all of you a little bit acquainted with the Bible, with stories in the Bible? If I'm saying something that you don't understand, or if it's going too fast, or you need more explanation, just interrupt me and I'll explain. I mean, I want you to understand. We are not many people, so we can make it a little bit more informal. So in this lecture, I will discuss some texts from rabbinic literature. I will explain what that is later. And especially from the rabbinic traditions called Midrash. So any of you has heard about Midrash already? No? Okay. So then we'll explain about that now. So the rabbinic literature contains the foundational sources of Judaism that are important up till the present day. These are sources that date from the 3rd to about the 10th century of the Common Era. The most important of these sources are the Mishnah, the Talmud. Actually, there's 2 Talmuds, and Midrashim. You probably already heard of the Talmud. In this lecture, I will mostly look at texts from the Midrash, from the Midrashim. Well, Midrash actually means rabbinic biblical interpretation. So the interpretations of the Bible and rabbinic tradition, they're called Midrash. So Midrash is sort of the genre of rabbinic biblical interpretations, but Midrash is also the name of a work, like a commentary on a biblical book is called a Midrash, a rabbinic commentary. There is many Midrashim. Midrashim is a plural of Midrash, it's in Hebrew, to various biblical books. For example, you've got a Midrash to the book of Genesis, you've got a Midrash to the book of Exodus, and so on. So it's separate works. Now, if some of you are maybe acquainted with biblical commentaries, modern biblical commentaries, these Midrashim are very different. They are creative, they add things to the text, they change things a little bit, they fill gaps. I will explain what that means. Like if there is something not explained in the text, they will explain it. And also, there can be several interpretations next to each other. So you could have a text, and you get one interpretation, and then it says another interpretation, and another interpretation, and they will all be followed one after the other without sort of a conclusion from this is the right interpretation. In Midrash, many interpretations can stand next to each other. Okay, what you will see also in the text that we will see is that very often verses from different texts, even from different biblical books, will be linked together. So they will make a connection between various verses in the text. Well, you will see it when we will discuss the examples. So to understand what the Midrash says about Rebekah, we first need to look carefully at the biblical texts about Rebekah, the texts about Rebekah in the Bible, and especially at her place in the stories of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. Midrash is always based on close reading. The ancient rabbis were experts in close reading, and if there's one thing that modern biblical scholars can learn from the ancient rabbis, then it is attention for details in the text. A second thing that we can learn from the rabbis is attention to intertextual connections, connections between more than one text. So we will therefore also study the connections between the several biblical texts that deal with Rebekah. Now, the texts about Rebekah are all concentrated in the biblical book of Genesis, from chapters 24 until chapter 27 about, and we will focus on the story in Genesis 24, which is a very long biblical story about the engagement of Rebekah to Isaac, and the marriage actually of Isaac and Rebekah. But as we will see, this chapter has intertextual links with the preceding chapters, chapter 22 and chapter 23. Chapter 22, in the beginning of chapter 22, we first get the famous story of the binding of Isaac. In the Jewish tradition, that's called Akedah, means binding. In the end of Genesis 22, we get a sort of genealogical list we will study that text later. And in Genesis 23, it is related that Sarah, Isaac's mother, dies. Now, between all these texts, there are some connections that we will look at. And as we will see, the rabbis in their Midrash, they pay a lot of attention to these connections. Okay, an important question in this paper is, how much choice did Rebekah have when it came to marrying Isaac? According to the Bible and according to the rabbis. Did she have an influence? Did she have a choice to marry him or not to marry him? And I will use the concept of agency to tackle this issue. Agency is a concept from social studies that is also often used in women's studies. And it's not an uncontested concept, and I'm also not a specialist in it, but for the purpose of this paper, a simple description of what agency is should be enough. So agency is the capacity of individuals to act independently and make their own free choices. That's sort of a simple definition. In the social sciences, agency is usually found in combination with structure, which includes the factors that limit agency. So a definition could be, by contrast, structure is those factors of influence, such as social class, religion, gender, and so on, that determine or limit an agent in their decisions. So I will just investigate how Rebekah's agency in the matter of her marriage to Isaac is depicted in the Bible and in the Rabbinic Midrash, and if there is any difference there. So let's first look at the Bible. In the biblical commentaries, the modern biblical commentaries, it is often remarked that compared to Abraham, Abraham the father of Isaac, and Jacob the son of Isaac, Isaac is not a very prominent patriarch. Indeed, in most of the stories, Isaac is a rather passive figure. First, he's almost sacrificed by his father in Genesis 22, as you know. Second, Isaac does not go and find a wife for himself, but rather the servant of his father is sent out to go and find a wife for him. Whereas, for example, Jacob does this himself. Third, he's cheated upon by his wife, Rebekah, and by his son, Jacob, when it comes to giving the blessing to his sons. So they make him bless the younger son instead of the older son, as he was supposed to do. And so because of he is almost an absent patriarch, many of the larger commentaries, such as the commentaries of Westermann, Spicer, and Skinner, well, I think they're only known for biblical scholars, but in those commentaries, they usually sort of divide the stories about Isaac over the Abram cycle and the Jacob cycle. So they say, well, the first stories they throw with the Abram cycle, and the later stories they put with the Jacob cycle, and Isaac is sort of not present. He doesn't have his own cycle of stories. Now, if one reads closely, however, the patriarchal generation of Isaac and Rebekah is not so inconspicuous. The remarkable thing, however, is that Rebekah is more prominent in these stories than Isaac. Rebekah is a very active character, not only in Genesis 26, where she sort of helps get her younger son the blessing, but also in Genesis 24, where her marriage with Isaac is discussed. But of course, the dominant matriarch, a dominant woman, did not really fit the paradigm of Westermann and his colleagues, so they simply did away with the second generation. They said, like, there is no second generation of patriarchs. In actually a very old article of mine in 1995, one of the first things that I ever published, I suggested to look at the stories about Isaac and Rebekah from the perspective of the woman. From this perspective, not only Rebekah, but actually also Isaac becomes more visible. The only thing it requires is, as they say in French, chercher la femme, just look at the woman figure. So therefore, I speak about the Isaac-Rebekah, or even the Rebekah-Isaac cycle, to speak about those stories about Isaac and Rebekah. Now, the connections between the texts. As I said, our main focus of attention is on Genesis 24. I've got a few verses here, but there are some connections between Genesis 24 and the last part of Genesis 22, the last verses of Genesis 22 that I have written out here. So within the Isaac-Rebekah cycle, we can discern various elements that Isaac and Rebekah in fact have in common. The conception and birth of Isaac is of course presented as a very special fact. His mother was already very old. His birth happens against all odds and is announced by a divine messenger, by an angel. But also Rebekah's birth is announced. And this happens in a passage that is easily skipped over, namely in this passage, because it's part of a rather boring list, a genealogical list. But let's read the text carefully. In Genesis 22, verses 20 to 23, it says, "It happened after these things that it was told to Abraham, Milcah too has borne sons to your brother Nahor. Uz, the firstborn, Buz, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Chadom, and so on." List. But then it says in verse 23, "Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother." Abraham receives this announcement, actually of the birth of Rebekah, because it says Bethuel became the father of Rebekah, as part of this list. He receives the birth announcement actually of 8 nephews at the same time, all these. And that is maybe probable because, as we know, Abraham lived far away from his family, so it's possible that he didn't really know that all these children had been born. So we get sort of message, "Oh, meanwhile, 8 children have been born to your family." But what interests us is that after this introduction of the 8 sons of Nahor, we hear out of the blue the name of Rebekah. It is the first mention of the name Rebekah in the Bible, and so far we have no idea why she should be mentioned here. We have no idea why she is important. In fact, we don't even know if she's already born at this moment. It says Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. It's possible maybe that this happens later, that the narrator announces something. But in any way, her name in this list is an anomaly, because apart from Aram, who is also here mentioned with his father, she is actually the only one of her generation that is mentioned here. Her older brother Laban, who is a rather famous figure in the Bible, is not mentioned here. So the mentioning of Rebekah here has a reason. In this text, actually, we get a glimpse of the hand of the redactor, who presents these Isaac-Rebekah stories as a sort of continuous whole, because he put it in here to make sort of a link to what will come. Now, the relevance of Rebekah will only become clear 2 chapters later in Genesis 24. We have the text here, where Rebekah, as I told, is sort of found by the servant of the father of Isaac, Abraham. The servant finds the woman. Of course, it's not an accidental find. There are several indications in the text that it is presented as if Rebekah is sort of predestined by God to become Isaac's wife. Moreover, both Abraham and the servant are convinced that God will help the servant find a suitable wife for Isaac. For example, we read in verse 7, the servant the servant makes a prayer, but he also, it's almost as if he sort of designs his own oracle, let's say. He says, well, let it happen this way, and then it happened that way. So he says, the Lord, the God of the heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my land of birth, that's actually Abraham who's speaking, and who spoke to me saying, to your descendants I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. This is actually what Abraham says. He says, you go there and this will happen. And then later in verse 12 and 14, I didn't put the text here, but the servant actually says the same. He prays and he says, please let it happen what my master said. Let I find a woman here at the well. He had traveled a long distance then. And then it says, then he says this. Well, actually, I will read what he says in verse 12 to 14. O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I'm standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels too, may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master. So the servant says, God, please let it happen this way, very detailed. Let a girl come, let she offer to give me water, let she offer also to give my camels water, which is not an obvious thing. And then I know that this is the woman that is, so he sort of orchestrates the whole thing. And of course, what happens? He had not even finished speaking, and behold, and then very strange, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother, came out with a jar on her shoulder. So the girl comes out, but already we know, we are told who she is. The son of Bethuel, the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. So we, the listeners, know who this girl is. The servant doesn't know, but we know. So pay attention to these words. Rebekah is introduced here in exactly the same words as in the announcement of her birth here in Genesis 22. Rebekah, born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. So we know immediately, okay, this is her, she's family, it's the right woman. Then, after this, she offers him and his camels to drink, as was supposed to be. But only in verse 24, after she has invited him to her family's house, and after she actually has been given presents by the family, after then, only then, actually, the servant asks, who are you? So he's already in the house, he has been received. We know that she's Rebekah, but he doesn't know. And then he asks, who are you? And then she answers, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. That's how she speaks about this herself, whom she bore to Nahor. It's an interesting way of speaking about yourself. So this is again an echo of the words we already know from Genesis 22, verse 20 and verse 23. It's a clear reference to this text where Rebekah has been announced. So now we know actually why in an earlier passage Rebekah has been announced and why she will be important in a later story. And the servant, on a text which is not mentioned here in 27, he says, of course, after all this has happened, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and is true toward his master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my father's brothers. So he knows now that he's in the right place. So this is the first connection that I wanted to show between Genesis 22 and some verses in Genesis 24. Now, there is more connections. So the servant now knows that he has found the right girl. But now, of course, he has to manage to take him back all the way to Abraham because they're far away from home. I mean, he's far away from home, she's home. So he has to sort of see that she will want to come with him on a long journey. So the question is, will her parents let her go with a stranger, a servant? Actually, it's not Abraham himself, it's not Isaac himself, but it's a servant. Will she herself want to leave? As a matter of fact, we will come back to this text, but indeed, the father and the brothers say in verse 51, here's Rebekah, take her and go. Okay. Later, the mother and the brother again say, okay, well, actually, they first sort of delayed a little bit, but let her stay a few weeks with us, but then she may go. Eventually, they ask her, are you willing to go with this man? And she says, I will go. So we know that she will want to go with them. We will look at the rabbinic interpretations of this text later because these are important texts. But what I wanted to show here is actually also the connection between Rebekah and what happened to Abraham many, many chapters before, in chapter 12, when Abraham himself went from the same place because he came from there. And the calling of Abraham, very famous calling, Lech Lecha, go from your country, your family, and your so on, your relatives. That is how the calling of Abraham is presented with this verb going. And now, actually, of Rebekah she has to do exactly the same as Abraham. She has to go from that same place, and actually she has to go to the same place as where Abraham went to. So I think there is also a sort of a deliberate connection between these two chapters here. But there's more. The important role of Rebekah next to Isaac is confirmed at the end of the very, very long story. We see the story of Genesis 24 has 67 verses, actually even more, but we're already here in verse 67. And in verse 67 we get actually a very interesting passage. It says, then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. So this is after she has come home. He took Rebekah and she became his wife and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Out of the blue, the death of his mother is mentioned here. So the circle is complete. A new matriarch has been found. But at this point, another intertextual connection needs to be highlighted because Sarah, his mother, had meanwhile died. So remember, Rebekah was first mentioned in chapter 22. Sarah was still living then. But immediately afterwards, in Genesis 23, the death of Sarah is related. It says Sarah became 127 years old. She died in the land of Canaan, and Abraham mourned for her death. So we know, it's actually a very sort of short mentioning, that Sarah died. I even found a painting of the death of Sarah. I think maybe this painting is related to the Midrash, but because she sort of seems to be fainting here. Yeah, I saw you already smiling, because I think the idea that Rebekah enters the tent of his mother with Isaac, I mean, why the tent of the mother? And then Isaac becomes comforted after the death of his mother. It's sort of a Freudian idea, you know, that's like the mother is dead, the man enters the same tent with his new wife, and all of a sudden he is happy again. Good. So now I will move to the Midrash. I will speak about gap filling and linkage in the Midrash. I will explain what that means. I once also wrote a story on that topic. The idea of gap filling is an idea that was, I think, first introduced by Meir Sternberg, a biblical scholar, who used the term filling of gaps to describe the phenomenon actually inherent to all biblical stories, or to actually the reading of biblical stories more. That if people read a story in the Bible, they have to, or they actually automatically sort of fill in some details that are not given in the text. Maybe that's inherent to the reading of many stories, but Sternberg, he wrote about that phenomenon with respect to especially biblical stories. Daniel Boyarin, he's a very famous scholar of rabbinic literature and especially of Midrash. He applied the term gap filling to Midrash, because in the Midrash, filling of gaps in the text is a technique that is very common. By filling up the gaps, elements that are not clear or unclear or not put very explicitly in the text, the Midrash makes connections between texts. And making of the connections, that's what I mean with linkage, like making links. So it actually goes together very often. There is some unclearnesses, some things that are not very explicit in the text, and by connecting that text to another biblical text, the unclear things are explained, and the link between the two stories is made. A simple example from the text that we are discussing here is, for example, that Abraham's servant in Genesis 24, the anonymous servant who goes out to find a wife for the son of Abraham, that servant has no name. he has a name, but his name is not given. He's always called the servant. The servant goes out, the servant does this, the servant does that. Whereas actually he has a very important task. He has to go to find a wife for the son of his master. Now in the Midrash, this is of course noticed. And in the Midrash, this servant is always called Eliezer. He's just given a name, Eliezer. But it's not just any name. Why Eliezer? Because earlier in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 15, verse 2, it is said that a servant, or maybe even more like a manager of Abraham, is called Eliezer of Damascus. And that Eliezer is called the heir of the house. Abraham says there, if I'm not going to get any children, this Eliezer of Damascus will inherit all my properties. So he's an important person in the household of Abraham. So there, this Eliezer is mentioned. In Genesis 24, Eliezer is not mentioned, but the rabbis, of course, they say, well, that must have been the same Eliezer because he was so important, he is Abraham's servant, so this one is also Eliezer. And that's why in all these texts about Genesis 24, this servant is always named Eliezer. So that's filling of a gap, the name is not mentioned, but they fill the gap. And how do they fill the gap? By making the link with another biblical story. So we'll now discuss these techniques of gap filling and linkage in the Midrash to the stories about Rebekah. We have seen the first part of this paper, when I was speaking about the biblical texts, that there are explicit links between the various mentionings of Rebekah in Genesis 22 and in Genesis 24. Moreover, there is a connection between Genesis 23, where Sarah dies, and the end of Genesis 24, where Isaac and Rebekah get together. So in the Midrash, these existing connections, these connections that are already present in the Bible, are linked to even more surrounding biblical texts, especially the text in Genesis 22 about the binding of Isaac, the Akedah story. And in order to do this, some more gaps will have to be filled and some more connections will have to be made to make this explicit. Now the story, the adventures of the patriarchs and matriarchs, they are extensively commented upon in the most well-known Midrash on the book of Genesis. It's a Midrash called Genesis Rabbah, means like the large Genesis. It's part of a series of commentaries on all the 5 books of the Torah and on also on the festive scrolls, some other scrolls from the Bible. So there's actually a collection of Midrashim. On each of these books, there is a separate work, a Midrash. And so the Midrash on the book of Genesis, Genesis Rabbah, is sort of a running commentary on every verse of the book of Genesis. So it starts Genesis 1, verse 1, commentary, Genesis 1, verse 2, commentary, and so on, until we are in Genesis 22 and 23 and 24 that we are discussing. This, this commentary, it's important to know when this text was written. It's written about the 5th century of the Common Era. That's actually called the period of classical rabbinic literature, of classical Midrash. Okay, so in this Genesis Rabbah, here is the first text that we will discuss. It's a commentary on Genesis 22, so on this announcement, on this announcement to Abraham. All the text that I have put in italics, the slanted text, is quotation from the Bible, and if it's straight up, it's an addition from the Midrash. Yeah? In the Midrash, always the biblical text is explicitly quoted. It's like a quotation and commentary, quotation, commentary. So the biblical verses are literally quoted, and then the commentary is sort of put in between. The commentary here, Genesis Rabbah chapter 57, that's not important for you, but I think I need to mention my sources. It starts with this quotation of, it happened after these things that it was told to Abraham, Milcah to us born sons, the text that we have read. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Okay? Abraham became the father of Rebekah. Now the Midrash goes on. It says about this same text, it says, while he was yet on Mount Moriah, he was informed, so Abraham, that his son's partner had been born. As it says, Milcah too has borne children, and so on. So in this Midrash, this genealogy that also mentions Rebekah is connected to the almost offering of Isaac in the just preceding text, the Akedah text, which is found just before in the Bible, in the beginning of Genesis 22. Because in Genesis 22, verse 2, we read that Abraham is called by God to go to the land of Moriah to lead his son up for a burnt offering. So the name Moriah is mentioned there as the place where this will happen. And so in this Midrash, this text that includes Rebekah, it's actually, it is important. First of all, it's interpreted as a real birth announcement to Abraham. But also it is said here that Abraham is said to have received this message after the almost offering of his son. This is explicitly said. While he was yet on Mount Moriah, he was informed that his son's partner had been born. So the Midrash explicitly says, well, he was actually still coming down from the mountain, and already then he got this message that these things would happen. And he got the message that Rebekah would be born. So several things are happening here. First of all, in the Bible we say Abraham was told. It doesn't say God said to Abraham. But the Midrash, it could have been anybody who told him. It could have been messengers. But in the Midrash, this Abraham was told is read as a divine announcement, as God speaking to Abraham. Very often, like a passive form, he was told, is interpreted in the Midrash as, God speaking. And not only Abraham received the message from God that Rebekah was born, but it is important that he received that message exactly in that place and at that time, just after he had almost sacrificed his son. You know that the sacrifice eventually didn't happen. But when he was still on the mountain after this terrible experience, he received that message, according to the Midrash. So in doing so, the rabbis explain the anomaly of this, the only woman who is actually mentioned in this text, Rebekah, in this announcement. It is explained by the rabbis, but they say, why is Rebekah mentioned here? Well, she needed to be mentioned at this time and at this place, and we will see why she needed to be mentioned at this time and at this place. So, according to the rabbis, this whole text, this whole list actually, was composed to mention Rebekah, to announce that a prospective wife for Isaac had been born. So I go to the next slide, which actually is a continuation of this text, because here we will focus on the introduction of the list. The list starts with, it happened after these things that I was told to Abraham, Milcah too is born, and so on. Now usually in the biblical translations, and in probably also in your translations, if it says it happened after these things, very often actually in the translation this is even left out. The translations don't always say it happens after these things, but if you would read in Hebrew, many biblical stories, they start with, it happened after these things that this happened. And usually we say, well, that's just a way of introducing a story. Like we would say, it happened a long time ago, or once upon a time. So the Bible says it happened after these things. The rabbis, they don't think this is enough. When a biblical story says it happened after these things, they always want to know after which things did this happen. What came before? They read it very literally. So for the rabbis, it's very crucial after which things this happened. And these things in question are explained in the continuation of this text in Genesis Rabbah. Quotation, it happened after these things. And then we get the Midrash. Thoughts about things were entertained here. Who was thinking? Abraham. He reflected. Had he died on Mount Moriah, Isaac, he surely would have died without children. Therefore now, I may indeed give him in marriage to one of the daughters of Aner, Eshkol, or Mamre, those are his neighbors, who are righteous women. For what does their birth matter to me? Well, they were not from his same family. So he says, well, anyway, my son has no wife yet. I have to go quickly and find a wife for my son. Because he almost died, and if he would have died, he would have been without children, and I would not have any grandchildren. I know, it was announced to Abraham that he would get a large offspring, and now the only one who could give him this offspring, actually it's not the only one, but okay, he doesn't have any children yet. So the Midrash continues. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, you don't need to do this. You don't have to marrying off to a woman of a strange family. For Isaac's partner has already been born. Therefore, Milcah too has borne children. So here the connection is made. So this actually, here the Midrash says it was very important that this announcement of the birth of Rebekah was given immediately after this almost sacrifice of Isaac, because the almost sacrifice of Isaac made Abraham think that he should do something about getting a wife for a son, because as we know earlier in the biblical text, Abraham was, God told him that he would get a large offspring, many children as the stars in the sky and the sand in the sea and so on. So in this way, these two texts, the Akedah text, the binding of Isaac text, and this introduction of Rebekah are connected in the Midrash. Okay, in the Midrash, many more connections are made. And also, one connection is made between actually the binding of Isaac's story and the story of the death of Sarah. Also there in the Bible, it is just said that Sarah dies. It's not explained, well, of course she was already 127 years old, so you could expect that at some point she would die. But it's not said like why she died or that she was sick or whatever. So in another Midrash, a connection is made between the death of Sarah and the immediately preceding binding of Isaac. There's actually many Midrashim of this, and this is one example that makes a connection. In this Midrash, it is said that Sarah had died from pure horror after hearing what had happened with her son Isaac, that her husband Abraham had bound her son on an altar and almost sacrificed her. This is a very late Midrash, Midrash Tanchuma, and here the story is told as this. While all this was transpiring, Satan, so during the Akedah, Satan visited Sarah in the guise of Isaac. So Satan sort of appeared to Sarah, but he looked like Isaac. When she saw him, she asked, "What did your father do to you, my son?" And Isaac replied, "My father led me over the mountains and through valleys until we finally reached the top of a certain mountain. There he erected an altar, arranged the firewood, bound me on the altar, took a knife to slaughter me. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not called out, 'Lay not your hand on my son or your son,' I would have been slaughtered." This is what Isaac says to his mother. He had hardly completed relating what had transpired when she fainted and she died. As is written, and Abraham came to mourn from Sarah and wept for her in Genesis 23, immediately after the Akedah story. From where did he come? From Mount Moriah. So here, also the Midrash makes this connection between Sarah dying immediately after this terrible story of the binding of Isaac. The Midrash also makes a connection between the death of Sarah and the birth of Rebekah. We already saw in Genesis 24, verse 67, that Isaac is comforted after the death of his mother when Rebekah comes. But this connection is made much more explicit in the Midrash. And it is made explicit by means of another verse. I already said in the Midrash, often you get verses from different books of the Bible connected. In this case, it's a verb from Kohelet. I don't know how you say Kohelet. You say Kohelet? Okay. The verse of Kohelet goes as follows: the sun rises and the sun goes down. Okay, it's a part of Kohelet. And here, this verse is applied to Sarah and Rebekah. Rabbi Brechia, often in the Midrash you got rabbis who are like mentioned. He said in the name of Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, do we not know that the sun rises and the sun goes down? Like, why is this even mentioned in the Bible? What it means, however, is that before the sun of one righteous person goes down, he causes the son of another righteous person to rise. Before he caused the son of Sarah to go down, he made the son of Rebekah rise. That is what is written. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah in Genesis 22. And after that is written, Sarah died in Kiryat Arba in Genesis 23. And it is also written, then Isaac brought her into his mother's Sarah tent. So here, these three verses which are actually in the Bible even in the same order, but usually we don't make the connection, are very explicitly connected by this midrash. So the sun comes up, the sun goes down, the circle of life continues. Sarah dies, Rebekah is born, and eventually she ends up with Isaac in Sarah's tent, as also said in the tent. And together they can start working on God's promise of a large offspring for Abraham. Now, back to the marriage earlier in the story. In Genesis 24, that story, which is actually it's more the engagement of Rebekah, but it ends with the marriage of Rebekah and Isaac. Rebekah is actually, she doesn't speak a lot. But on the other hand, she is actually all the time in action. She fetches water for all these camels. She runs up and down the hill to bring this water to the servant, to the camels. She runs to her house. She arranges all sorts of things, but she doesn't speak much. So with this quick sentence of action verbs presents Rebekah as a very sort of proactive woman. And this is also confirmed in the passage where her marriage with Isaac is being discussed. We already saw some verses of this text, but in Genesis 24, verse 50, well, we first actually read that her family wants to let her go. Laban, her brother, and Bethuel, her father, they say, the Lord has done this, we have no choice in the matter. Take Rebekah with you, she can marry your master's son, just as the Lord has said. That's the first time this is mentioned. Okay. But then, later, a few verses later, in verse 55, the brother, again, Laban, and the mother say, well, let her stay for a few more days, and then afterwards she can go. Now the servant sort of starts to lose his patience. He says, well, first you said that she could go, and now I have to wait like another 10 days or so. So then they say, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. We'll ask her, does she want to go? They called Rebekah and they said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. We already looked at this text before. So first the father says, okay, and the brother, then the mother and the brother say, well, let her wait a bit longer. He doesn't like it. So they ask her herself, and she says, okay, I will go. Now, we don't know of whether this was the normal procedure in the time when the story is playing. For the narrator, this is an occasion to sort of demonstrate the agency of Rebekah. The short answer of Rebekah, I will go, is remarkable. In Hebrew, we read only one word, actually. Elech, I will go. It's only one word. As I mentioned in the beginning of this paper, this verbal form is a reflection of the famous calling of Abraham to leave his country, the same country, in Genesis 12, verse 1. There also is told to Abraham, go from your country, your place of birth, to the house of, out of the house of your father, and go to this land I will show you. And Rebekah has to do exactly the same. And she does it without hesitation. She says, I will go. It's her own choice. Now in the Midrash, this sort of independent behavior of Rebekah, because we see her mother and her brother actually want her to stay a little bit longer, but she says, I will go. In the Midrash, this independent behavior is acknowledged and elaborated, as usually the Midrash does. The fact that Rebekah is asked, and also her very short answer, I will go, is highlighted in this Midrash, again from Genesis Rabbah. Starts with a quotation, and they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes, this verse. From this, says the Midrash, we learn that a fatherless girl may not be given in marriage without her consent. they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rabbi Abba, said in Rabbi Isaac's name, they hinted to her, will you actually go? And she said, I will go against your will and without your permission. That is what the Midrash says. This is not in the Bible, this is the Midrash text. So let's look at this text. To start with, we find a piece of sort of a rule that is given here. It's called, we call this Midrash Halacha. A rule is made out of biblical text. The rule is here, from this we learn that a fatherless girl may not be given in marriage without her consent. As a matter of fact, we don't find this rule anywhere in the rest of the rabbinic literature. Most of those kinds of rules you would find in the Mishnah or in the Talmud, and nowhere we actually find a rule that a girl without a father may not be married without her consent. But this is, first of all, remarkable. But another remarkable thing is going on here. Do you see something strange here? Yeah? What do you see? Okay, that is certainly also remarkable. But why is she a fatherless maiden? The father is still speaking in here. So why does the Midrash say that she has no father? Well, then we have to go to another Midrash, one that I can summarize here. I didn't quote it on the text. But in another Midrash, this is remarked that here the brother and the father are speaking, and 5 verses later, the brother and the mother are speaking. So the rabbis and the Midrash, they say, why all of a sudden are the brother and the mother speaking and not the brother and the father? Oh, they say, well, the father, he must have died meanwhile. And so there is this Midrash that says, well, there was a night in between, and in that night, the father actually, Bethuel, he tried to retract. He tried to hinder that Rebekah would go with the servant. He actually wanted to say, well, actually, I don't think she can go with you. So because he was trying to do that, God, of course, killed him immediately. So he fell dead in the night. And the next morning, the brother and the mother have to decide because now the father is not there anymore. So this is the kind of thing that in the Midrash happens. It's a very close reading. Here it says the brother and the father, and all of a sudden it's the mother and the brother. So why is that? Well, we could find another explanation for it. We would say, well, maybe, because it's the mother who makes more of a problem and the father doesn't mind. But the Midrash says, well, no, the father has disappeared. So this means that he died, and this means that she's a fatherless girl. So then they make this rule. A fatherless girl may not be given in marriage without their consent. Now, there is something else that this verse, they called Rebekah and they said to her, will you go with this man? Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rabbi Abba, says, they hinted to her, will you actually go? So the rabbis say, actually, they spoke sort of in a suggestive way. If they say, will you go? They actually meant like, do you really want to go? Like as if they were suggesting her, please don't go, stay. But she says, I will go. But they make this more explicit. They say, I will go against your will and without your permission. That is what the Midrash says here. This is a remarkable text. It's not that this is very common in rabbinic literature. So this answer says enough. This Rabbi Hanina, who is speaking here, presents Rebekah's agency and her acting against her mother and her brother as a positive thing. I mean, he presents it here as not as a negative thing. So maybe this is related to the negative image of Laban. We cannot go in details here, but Laban actually in rabbinic literature, he is presented as a bad guy. He's just not a good one. This has to do with Jacob and other things. So maybe it has to do with Laban, who is sort of the bad one, that Rebekah, good thing that she goes against his will. But maybe it's also, we get a glimpse of the positive thinking about the agency of girls and women in the eyes of at least certain rabbinic sages. I have one last picture. This is just because I thought this was a nice picture. It's just, this is where Isaac meets eventually Rebekah, because at the end of the long story, Rebekah goes down with the servant on the camel and so on, and then at the end of the story it says that she came to the land of Canaan, and then she came from the camel. Actually, some Midrashim even say that she fell from the camel, because that's the tipol. What? Yeah, so it's, maybe. So there's all sorts of stories about that too, that she fell from the camel and this and that. Anyway, here is a painting that depicts how Rebekah and Isaac, in fact, meet at the end of the long story. So that's my story. So
thank you so much for sharing